Don't settle for fakes. My duel-taining is the real deal.
Hey everyone, it's mekklord, and today I come to you with a tier list for the World Championship qualifiers that I've just started. This tier list will go over 30 decks that I have handpicked, more or less 30 decks, you'll see. And discuss which ones should you be playing, which ones should be preparing against it. Basically evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of like these decks compared to the current metagame and just, define the current metagame. So as a quick recap, tier 1 decks are going to be the decks to be the ones that you should be focused on, the ones that are going to be the most common encounters on in the first and second stages of this World Championship qualifiers. Tier 2 decks that are pretty good, have some advantages over the tier 1 decks, but are mostly not as good as these very specific decks. Tier 3 decks are going to be decks that are pretty good, but sorely lacking. Maybe they have a bad matchup against these decks, maybe they only have one good matchup against these decks, and they're kind of mediocre against everything else. And Rogue is basically everything that's still playable but doesn't fit in those categories. Something like, starting with Abyss Actors, I think is the peak example of a Rogue deck. It's a deck that has recently gotten support. It does one thing, well, it does two things. The first thing it does is OTK right out of the gate. The second thing it does is activate Mellow Madonna turn 1 in order to then use Sealed Tombs so that your opponent is locked out of their graveyard, which is somewhat relevant in this metagame, especially against, decks like Orcust. Some decks like DDDs also use the graveyard. Decks like Chronomaly can sometimes use the graveyard, Phantom Knight of course, Speedroid and stuff. That sounds pretty good on paper, especially considering the recent addition of Abyss Actor extras make this really more consistent. The issue is, it doesn't do a whole lot of stuff other than that. OTKing sounds nice, but it doesn't happen really as frequently as you'd like. The deck has some issues beating over big monsters, and its only form of removal is targeted destruction, which doesn't really make it against, Orcust, just in general. For this reason, I feel like Abyss Actor is a safe, comfortable rogue pick. Speaking of rogue pick, Burning Abyss, you've noticed that I've put these in alphabetical order, probably. Burning Abyss, a deck that has been in the metagame for a very long time, a deck that has seen better days for sure. Definitely also a rogue contender. I think the deck is still very popular for comparatively how good it is. I wouldn't be surprised to see a couple of BA players in stage 1, stage 2. I don't think there's going to be that many. The third rogue-ish deck I'm going to put on the list here, I think it's somewhat better than BA. I think Abyss Actor is better than BA too. It's Block Dragon. So what is Block Dragon? Block Dragon is a deck that aims to use and abuse rock and earth monsters in order to quickly swamp the field and make a couple of link plays turn 1. It can be played as an Orcust variant, if I'm not mistaken, although I don't think this specific variant is too popular. And basically you're just building a couple of Synchro Basters, Xyz monsters turn 1, and locking your opponents out of their effects with Amano Iwato using the skill Smile Whirl, which basically just makes it so Amano Iwato doesn't return to your hand at the end of the turn, which kind of broken, added with the protection that Block Dragon provides, which says that monsters can be destroyed except by battle, monsters you control that is. That makes it a rather annoying deck to face. It's really gimmicky, it's not all that consistent, but it exists, so it deserves a mention. Keeping on with the rogue decks, we have Trickstar. Trickstar I think is one of the more competent rogue decks, maybe a low tier 3 rogue, but the game plan hasn't really changed since the last KC Cup. It doesn't do anything new or particularly exciting. It's just a decent option, but somewhat limited in my opinion. Chronomaly is, in my opinion, a tier 3 deck. It's pretty good at what it does, and what it does is often set up 2 monster negate turn 1s or 1 monster negate and any amount of synergistic back row. Something like Barrage Blast is really helpful for this deck to shine, especially considering Vimara can basically re-equip Xyz material onto itself at will, which are pretty good in my opinion. For this reason, I think Chronomaly is pretty good. It does have the same It does share some weaknesses with Orcust, namely DD Crow is a card that this deck does not like. High DP is also a huge problem for this deck. But other than that, I think it's a very competent deck with a limited ceiling in terms of what it can, you know, deal with and beat over. Courtstalker Salamangreat, winner of the last 2 KC Cups, I think is a decent tier 3 deck. I think it has kind of fallen out of the wayside because of all the nerfs to this deck in specific, mostly Salamangreat, but also because, you know, Orcust is just the talk of the town. You've gotten so many better decks since the last KC Cup. This deck is still competent, but what it does is not nearly as impressive as it once was, and old decks just don't really cut it anymore. Speaking of old decks, DDD. A lot of people are coping about DDD being a decent rogue pick. I guess it's like at the low end of tier 3. It can be pretty explosive, it's more consistent than it was before thanks to the recent unlimits. Not unlimits rather, but like, yeah, there was an unlimit, wasn't there? But what it does is still not all that impressive. You beat over a monster and you make Giant Coach McGurk turn 1 and you draw 3 cards, some amount of which might actually be relevant to this matchup, to the matchup you're facing, and that's it. Then you make Sanaphon maybe? I don't know. I don't think this deck is like all that great, but it's still very playable. Dark Magician is rogue. Dark Magician is a pretty okay-ish deck to be playing without like thinking too much about your plays. The ceiling is pretty low on this deck, which is also what kind of goes against it. Like targeted banishment and the ability to OTK rather quickly is a huge advantage, but it's not all that impressive. It's not all that impressive. I'm really torn on Cosmo. I don't think it's all that good because it's very inconsistent. Even with 1-for-1 and 3 Cosmo tin cans, you're going to end up on hands that don't really achieve much. The fact that tin cans add is random is an issue. The fact that you will need to deal with targeting removal by sacrificing of sorts your tin can or your other playmakers is annoying. Also requires the prerequisite of having other Cosmos in hand, and the best thing this deck can achieve is a 3000 beta with targeted destruction, which doesn't work well against Orcust. The fact that Orcust is like so prevalent is really holding back a lot of these decks in my opinion. Metal Furs, I think, is one of the okay-ish tier 3 decks. It's a deck that has been consistently played since its release. It has gotten a couple of new toys every now and then. Not recently, but it's still a deck that is played and beloved by like a small community of players. It shows up from time to time in tournaments, and I wouldn't be surprised if we saw 1, maybe 2 Metal Furs lists in the top 100 for this World Championship qualifiers. Finally, getting to the good decks, we have Odd Eyes Orcust at tier 1. I think this is one of the best decks of the current format. I'm not sure if it's like straight up better than the pure Odd Eyes version, but Orcust is just an insane engine to be playing in general, and I think the Odd Eyes package is the one that can make the most use of it, with the ability to easily get material to extend your plays, or just start your Orcust combo. And the real possibility of OTKing as early as turn 3. It's also very funny, like Orcust Nightmare is a level 7 monster, which works with like, what's this card called? Volophanegus, the Doom Dragon Rider, or whatever it's called. But yeah, like I said, Odd Eyes, and I mean the newest version of Odd Eyes, Raging Odd Eyes if you will, is a tier 1 deck as well. It's a deck that is expected to be very popular, very powerful, and which you should keep an eye out for. Omni Hero, meaning the version of Hero that plays like Vision Heroes and is more OTK centric than its Super Poly searching counterpart. I think it's a tier 3 deck as well. Like the ability of this deck to close out games really quick goes in its favor in such a format, but also like it has still a rather weak turn 1 end boards, and it's not the most difficult deck to play around considering it plays very little disruption. Onomats, I think, is at the higher end of tier 3. I think it's an underrepresented deck at the moment, mostly due to the fact that it is really expensive to make, considering their best card is you are locked in a selection box, which thanks for that, Konami. But I wouldn't be surprised to see this deck like be one of the breakout decks of this World Championship qualifiers, considering that it is insanely consistent and can make answers depending on the matchup. You know, you have Steelstorm's Roach for Speedroid, you have a Beast Dweller for Orcust, and you can make several others, so fun. Speaking of Orcust, I'm just gonna put Orcust in tier 1. I don't think this is like contentious in any way. I think this is the clear best deck of the meta. I think the pure variant is like even better than most of the other variants, which is concerning. And hopefully this deck gets nerfed in significant ways. I would love to see Mermaid being banned specifically, and a limit 3 on like Harp Aura and Orcust Nightmare. I think that's all that it would really take for this deck to stop being such a nuisance. Because it's a really cool deck to be facing, it's just not as cool to be facing it when it's the only deck you're facing. Orcust variants, I just put all of them together because I mostly don't care. That includes Crystal Beast and again Dora. I think these two variants are the best non-odd ice variants that you could be playing, and they're solid tier 2 decks in my opinion. They compensate for some of the weaknesses that Orcust has with some other lines that you can access uniquely with these very specific decks. Yeah, I'm not going to talk more about it. It's just more Orcust. It's just more Orcust, TBH. Phantom Knights, I want to put them before... Yeah, there we go. I want to put them before Nomads. Phantom Knights, I think, is tier 3. Remember when this was supposed to be the best deck in the previous formats? It was just dominated by Mech Knights and Salamangreats once again. Yeah, and this got nerfed anyway. I haven't seen a PK player in a while because everything that is an annoyance for Orcust, DD Crow, Lancia, Abyss Dweller, Necro Valley, Seal Tombed, is also an annoyance for PK. That's a really bad matchup in general, but also this deck is still capable of like using its back row, because there's still no limit 3 on these, in order to clutch out a couple of wins every now and then. Red Raptors is one of the new decks that we recently got, and I think it's a solid low tier 2 contender. I think as far as tier 2 decks go, it's probably one of the weakest ones. But it's probably one of the ones that shows them a promise. I wouldn't be surprised to see this also being a breakout deck for this format. I wouldn't be surprised to see people just playing a couple of Red Raptor cards in their otherwise completely and perfectly valid Orcust deck as well. Resonators, tier 3, Red Rain, such a cool card, right? That's still all that the deck does. Nothing has really changed for this, and we've got an Orcust in the meantime. And once again, this deck is susceptible to some of the graveyard hate that other decks will be playing in order to prepare for Orcust. Something like DD Crow can be particularly devastating for this deck, although it does not really care about other cards such as, you know, Lancia. I don't think is an issue for it. Beast Dweller is not all that important. But if you're facing Resonators, and that's very telegraphed, you're going to have to deal with Steelstorm's Roach or Evilswarm Nightmare, both of which are also issues on their own. Speaking of decks that can make Steelstorm's Roach or Evilswarm Nightmare, Rokkets, probably one of the better tier 2 decks out there. It's a deck that has gotten a huge buff in the form of its skill that no longer requires you to return a card to the deck in order to get basically a free field spell. Like you don't even need Striker Dragon in this game. You just have this for free, and you can set up multiple bosses turn 1. Evilswarm Nightmare, the recently added Void Augur Dragon, which is not all that popular yet, and more importantly, thanks to the buff to the skill, people have taken to playing a lot more back row, which make this deck very annoying to face, and it's probably one of the decks that I'm going to be picking for this WCQ. Rose Dragon, that's probably over there. I don't know. I'm really torn because I really hate the deck, but also I don't think it's that particularly threatening anymore. I'm gonna put it there and call it a day. I'm gonna finally stop molding about this deck. It's time to grow, it's time to admit that maybe this deck was never really all that good to begin with. Post nerf. Although it's still going to show up and I'm still going to be really annoyed by it. Pure Salamangreat is pure Salamand bad. There's nothing that the deck really does that's going to contend with a 2600 attack monster beating over you and clearing your field every turn. S-Force is one of the better tier 3 decks in my opinion. It can rather consistently set up some very annoying loops that turn your entire field into macrocosmos and then activate a trap that just banishes your whole field. That's very fun and pretty good in a game that is currently very focused about the graveyard and stuff, so pretty good there. Mekklord, I think, is one of the, like, either right there or right there. I think it's like, I'm gonna be conservative and put it there. I think it's a really good, you know what, actually, screw this, it's better than Raid Raptors. I'm gonna put it over there. Like, Mekklord is probably one of the best Pendulum strategies that isn't carried by an anime skill, although United Pendulums is very powerful as well. It's a deck that is rather tricky to play against because you're going to have to read a lot of cards and pay attention to a lot of stuff on the field, like the pendulum text on these cards, the monster effects, the scales for some of the back row that they can search. They can adjust. It's just really a handful of a deck to be playing against, in my opinion. Speedroids are they're showing some promise, but also they just don't do much against Roach, especially considering it's a deck that is not playing a lot of disruptive back row. So I'm gonna put it over there. Yeah. It's a deck that looks great on paper, but in reality you're going to have to face decks that are going to steamroll over you. Starry Night, I think, is one of the weakest tier 3 deck. Maybe it's even rogue-ish. Could be a rogue-ish deck. The deck is not like particularly impressive, but it does trip up opponents, and there's a lot of like dark decks in the current meta, so that's something that this deck can leverage, right? Super Poly tier 2. I don't think this is like a contentious opinion either. The ability to just wipe a whole field clean by searching a spell card that your opponent can't respond to is still broken. And it's a really huge surprise to me that this deck hasn't gotten nerfed in any way or shape. The turn 1 is like not all that great on this deck, but also because you don't have any extra deck restrictions, you can go like into like Solid Soldier, into Stratos or Blazeman, who cares? And then you just make a Bezdweller and you probably win games against like a lot of decks on this list. Wow, what a fun format. Synchrons, I've gotten a lot of hits in the previous KC Cups. I think I'm gonna put it over there because I expect this deck to also be sort of a breakout deck, leveraging the recent release of Crystal Wing and the already like previous ability to go into Stardust Warrior to clutch out a lot of wings that wouldn't be clutched out otherwise. I think this deck is weaker than Speedroid because it is even more vulnerable to disruption. You have even less space for a generic tech, and you're even more reliant on like specific combo pieces that if they get disrupted, you just lose. Also, Graveyard hates this deck a lot. World Chalice hasn't been quite the same since the left to Labyrinth Builder. I've seen a lot of people experiment with Code Soccer Alive. I've seen a lot of very funny people play with Land of Jammers. I think it's gonna be there. I think there's gonna be like maybe at most one player that like goes really far with this deck, and then that's their secondary or tertiary deck. And yeah, it's just not quite the same deck anymore. And finally, the old version of Odd Eyes playing the Xian Magicians. It can still make raging, and I guess maybe there's a way to leverage Laser Draw in that. Probably not. It's definitely not, actually. Yeah, I think it's like, why would you be playing this over the raging version is really weird to me. So all in all, this is what the tier list looks like. If you skipped to the end of the video, so you can comment about how I forgot about like ritual beasts or whatever, feel free to comment that and feel free to discuss and argue and talk about how wrong this list is. I think it's a very contentious metagame, other than like the fact that Orcust is so dominant. I've even hesitated to make a tier 0 called Orcust because I think like Orcust is nearing tier 0 status. Not because it is like impossible to counter, the counters are known and very easy, but because it is so represented, it has so many results. I think like Orcust might actually be tier 0. So let's pretend that I did say that Orcust was tier 0. Orcust is tier 0. The best decks are Orcust variants. So yeah, feel free to argue, agree or disagree with this tier list. Thank you for watching this video. Hope this helped you like refine your decks and think about what you're gonna play if you're serious about this WCQ. I'm not. I'm gonna be too busy moving, as you can probably guess. And yeah, thanks again for watching. I'll see you guys and gals and non-binary pals next time.